The woman my family spent 30 years calling a thief looked me in the eyes across her kitchen table and said, "You look exactly like your grandmother did at your age." And that was the moment I understood that everything I thought I knew about my own family was a story someone else had written for me. My name is Serena. I'm 31 years old. I work as a paralegal at a small firm in Mississauga, which means I spend my days reading contracts and spotting the sentences people hope you'll skip over. That skill, as it turned out, was the only reason I found out the truth at all. My aunt lived 4 houses down from us when I was growing up. Same street, same subdivision, same view of the hydro towers cutting across the back field. You'd think that would mean something, that proximity would soften whatever had happened between her and my mother. But for as long as I can remember, we didn't speak to her. We didn't wave when we saw her car in the driveway. When she appeared at the end of the block, my mother would find a reason to turn us around and go back inside. When I was 7, I asked why. My mother set down the dish she was washing and looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "She stole from this family, from your grandfather. She took things that weren't hers and she has never once apologized for it." I was 7. I accepted this. You do, at that age, you take the story you're given and you build your whole understanding of the world around it. So I grew up believing my aunt was a thief, a cold, selfish woman who had torn the family apart over money. My father confirmed it when I asked him years later, though he was vaguer about it, the way he always was about anything that made him uncomfortable. "Your mother's family had a falling out," he said. "It's old history. Leave it alone." I left it alone for 24 years. My grandfather died in October. He was 83, and the end was not a surprise. He'd been in a memory care facility in Burlington for the last 2 years, and we'd been visiting less and less as he stopped recognizing us. I won't pretend the grief was simple. It wasn't. There's a particular kind of loss that comes from watching someone disappear before they're gone, and by the time the funeral arrangements were being made, I'd already been mourning him for a long time. The will reading was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the burial. My mother asked me to come, which I thought was a formality. I wasn't expecting to be named in the will, and I wasn't. But I was a paralegal. I could read the documents. I think that's what she really wanted. I sat in the lawyer's office and I listened. My grandfather had left the house, a semi-detached in Hamilton that had been in the family since the 70s, to my mother. His savings, modest, split between my mother and my uncle on my grandmother's side. His personal effects to be divided as the family saw fit. Nothing unusual, nothing surprising. Except, I was reading the document while the lawyer spoke, the way I always do, because I find it faster than listening. And I saw a clause on the 3rd page that made me read it again. It referenced a property transfer executed in 2003. A transfer of a secondary property, a small cottage on Georgian Bay that had been deeded over to my mother at that time. The clause confirmed that this transfer had been completed and was not subject to the current estate. I looked up. My mother was nodding along to something the lawyer was saying. I thought, I didn't know my grandfather owned a cottage. I also thought, 2003. I was 9 years old in 2003. I had no memory of a cottage. No memory of visits, of summers on Georgian Bay, of anything that would explain why a piece of property had been quietly transferred to my mother while I was in the 4th grade. I didn't say anything in the meeting. I wrote the clause down in my notebook. I took the transit home and I made myself dinner and I told myself it was nothing. A piece of property, a legal transfer, completely normal. But I'd spent 6 years reading contracts. I knew what a quietly buried clause looked like. And this felt like one. I called the land registry office the next morning from my lunch break. The cottage on Georgian Bay had been transferred in 2003, yes. But what the will hadn't mentioned was that there had been a second property, a duplex in Guelph, purchased by my grandfather in 1987, that had been transferred in 1999, 4 years earlier, to a different name. My aunt's name. I sat in the break room with my phone in my hand and I stared at the wall for a long time. So my grandfather had given my aunt the duplex in 1999, and 4 years later my mother had received the cottage. These were 2 separate transfers, 2 separate gifts, or payments or decisions my grandfather had made. And my mother had spent my entire childhood telling me my aunt was a thief. I went home that night and I pulled out the only photograph I had of my grandfather's family, a formal portrait taken sometime in the 80s before everything fell apart. My grandfather and grandmother in the center, my mother on the left, maybe 20, maybe a bit older, and my aunt on the right with her arm around my grandmother's shoulders, smiling at the camera like she was the happiest person in the room. I had never really looked at that photograph before. I looked at it now. My aunt had my grandmother's eyes. I'd never noticed that before either. Or maybe I had noticed and I'd never let myself think about it, because thinking about it would mean thinking about her as a real person instead of cautionary story. I put the photograph down. I thought about what my mother had said when I was 7. She stole from this family, from your grandfather. She took things that weren't hers. But the land registry didn't lie. My grandfather had transferred that duplex to my aunt himself, signed and witnessed, and registered with the province. You don't steal something that someone hands you with their own signature. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I had made a decision that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I was going to knock on my aunt's door. She still lived on our street. 41 years in that house, apparently. I looked it up on the municipal property records because by this point I was looking everything up. She'd never moved. She'd watched us come and go for 3 decades from 4 houses away, and as far as I knew, we had never once acknowledged that she existed. I waited until a Saturday. I drove past the house twice first, which was ridiculous given that I knew the street by heart, but I needed to see if there were lights on, if there was any sign of life. There was. A lamp in the front window, a car in the driveway, an older Civic, sensible, well-maintained. I parked and I sat there for 10 minutes. Then I thought about the photograph. I thought about my grandmother's eyes. I got out of the car. She answered on the second knock. She was smaller than I expected. I'd built her up so large in my imagination that the actual person standing in the doorway caught me off guard. She was in her mid-60s, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She was wearing a cardigan that had seen better days, and she was holding a mug of tea. She looked at me and she went very still. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was quiet, not cold, just careful. "You're Serena." "Yes," I said. "You look exactly like your grandmother did at your age." I don't know why that broke something open in me. I hadn't expected to feel anything standing on that step. I'd come with questions, not emotions. But my grandmother had been gone for 15 years, and no one in my family ever talked about her, not really, and hearing a stranger say that, so plainly, so simply, like it was just a fact and not a grenade, I had to take a breath before I could speak. "Can I come in?" I asked. She stepped back and held the door open. Her kitchen smelled like coffee and something baking. Banana bread, as it turned out, a pan of it cooling on the counter. She gestured to the table, and I sat down and she poured me a cup of tea without asking, the way people do when they've been alone long enough that company requires a ritual. "I found the land registry records," I said, because I didn't know how else to start. "The duplex in Guelph. The transfer in 1999. She wrapped both hands around her mug. I wondered when someone would. "My mother told me you stole from the family." She didn't flinch. That surprised me. "I know what your mother told you. Is it true?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "No, it is not true. But I also understand that the truth is more complicated than a simple no." She told me the story over the next 2 hours, with the banana bread on the table between us and the October light coming through the window. She told me carefully, without dramatics, checking herself when she started to editorialize. I noticed that. I filed it away. "My grandfather," she said, "had 2 daughters. My mother was the older one by 4 years, and she had always been the one he understood better. They were alike, she and my grandfather, both practical, both good with money, both uncomfortable with anything that couldn't be measured. My aunt was the younger one, the one who had studied art history at York, who had married young and divorced young, and raised her daughter mostly alone in that house on the street where we all lived. When my grandmother got sick, a long illness starting in the early 90s, It was my aunt who moved back into the house to help care for her. Not my mother. My mother was in Mississauga by then, working, building a life, visiting on weekends when she could. My aunt quit her part-time job at a gallery. She was there for 5 years. When my grandmother died, my grandfather sat down with both daughters and said he wanted to make sure my aunt was taken care of. He'd already done well for my mother, helped with the down payment on the Mississauga house, helped with a car when hers died, small things that added up. For my aunt, who had given up years of earning to be a caregiver, he wanted to give something concrete. The duplex in Guelph. It wasn't work of fortune, it was 1999 and it was Guelph, and the building needed work. But the rental income was steady and it meant my aunt had something. A foundation. My mother found out 6 months later. She called it a betrayal. She told my grandfather that he'd been manipulated, that my aunt had played on his grief, that she'd positioned herself as the devoted caregiver precisely to get her hands on an asset. My grandfather told her she was wrong. My mother told my grandfather that she couldn't accept his judgment on this, and that was it. That was the whole thing. A property that my grandfather gave freely that my mother decided had been stolen. A version of events that had calcified into fact over 30 years, passed down to me at age 7 as a dish was being washed. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought, my mother is not a monster. She had genuinely believed this, or she had needed to believe it, which is not quite the same thing, but is close enough that the distinction stops mattering after a certain number of years. But she had also let me grow up without an aunt. She had walked me past this house, 4 houses away for 24 years, without once suggesting that the person inside was anything other than a villain. I asked my aunt about my grandfather's last years. She said she had visited him at the memory care facility when his condition allowed, when she was sure my mother wouldn't be there. She didn't say this with bitterness. She said it the way you say something that has become simply true. An accommodation you've made so long it no longer chafes. She showed me photographs of him from those visits. He was smiling in most of them. That mattered to me more than I expected. I drove home that afternoon with my hands too tight on the wheel and the radio off. Over the next 2 weeks, I did what I always do when I need to understand something. I went through the paper trail. I requested documents through the provincial registry. I looked at the original deed transfer, the witness signatures, the date. I found a letter. My aunt had kept a copy that my grandfather had written to his lawyer at the time, explaining his intentions, asking that the transfer be handled sensitively given family dynamics. He had known there would be conflict. He had done it anyway because he believed it was right. I called my boyfriend one night. We'd been together for almost 3 years, living together for 1, and I told him what I was finding. He listened, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you going to tell your mom?" "I don't know yet," I said. "What are you hoping to get out of it?" And I realized I didn't have a clean answer to that. I wasn't hoping for an apology. Exactly. I wasn't hoping my mother would admit she'd been wrong in a tidy, legible way that would let me feel resolved. I think what I was actually hoping for, the thing I hadn't been able to name until he asked, was that my mother would see that she had a sister, that it wasn't too late for that to mean something. I made an appointment with a lawyer at my firm, not for legal action. There was no legal action to take. The transfers were decades old and entirely legitimate. I wanted someone to review the documents with me, to confirm that what I was reading was what I thought I was reading. She spent 40 minutes going through everything and then looked up and said, "Your grandfather gave your aunt that properties as compensation for caregiving. That's unambiguous. There's a paper trail and a letter of intent." This was a gift properly executed. I thanked her. I went home. That evening, I called my mother. I didn't go in with an accusation. I went in with a question. I told her I'd been going through some of Grandpa's paperwork, true, and I'd come across the 1999 transfer to my aunt, also true, and I was trying to understand the context. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted long enough that I started to wonder if the call had dropped. "Where did you find that?" she said. Not a question. "Land registry," I said. "It's public record." Another silence. Then, "That transfer was not what it looked like." What did it look like to you? She had been influencing him for years. Since your grandmother got sick, she made herself indispensable. She made him feel guilty. She cared for grandma for 5 years, I said. She quit her job to do it. That was her choice. I had rehearsed what I was going to say next, but when the moment came, the rehearsed version felt too polished, too lawyerly, so I just said it plainly. Mom, I went to see her. The silence this time was different. Harder. I've been 4 houses away from my aunt my entire life, I said, and I never knew her. I didn't even know her name until I was a teenager. That's not something I can just accept anymore, now that I know why. My mother said she needed some time. I said, okay. I meant it. I wasn't trying to force anything. And I knew that what I was asking her to look at was painful in a way I probably didn't fully understand yet. But I also knew that I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't seen the documents. I wasn't going to walk past my aunt's house 4 houses away and treat her like a ghost anymore. I'd spent my career learning that the sentences people hope you'll skip over are usually the most important ones. 3 months passed. They were difficult months. My mother and I talked less than usual, and when we did, we stayed on safe ground: my work, her garden, my boyfriend's job. The thing between us sat unaddressed, not gone, just set aside the way you set aside something you're not ready to deal with. My aunt and I started having tea on Saturday mornings, not every Saturday, but most of them. I learned that she had a daughter, a cousin I had never met, who lived in Victoria and worked in marine biology and apparently had her mother's eyes and her own kind of stubbornness. I learned that my aunt had eventually sold the Guelph duplex, used the proceeds to pay off the house and take a trip to Portugal with a friend, and had never once thought of the money as something she'd taken. Because she hadn't taken it. It had been given to her by a man who understood what she had sacrificed, and who wanted her to have something to show for it. I learned that she had tried to reach my mother twice in the years after the estrangement. Once when my grandmother died, and once when my grandfather moved into the memory care facility. Both times, the calls had gone unanswered. I asked her if she was angry about that. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I was angry for a long time. I'm not anymore. What I am is sad, I think. I missed watching you grow up. I missed knowing my sister. That's the loss that stays with you. Not the argument, but everything the argument took with it. In February, my mother called me on a Sunday afternoon. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and then, near the end of the call, she said, I've been thinking about what you said, about the documents. Okay, I said. I'm not saying I was wrong, she said, in a voice that sounded like someone walking carefully along a ledge. But I'm also not sure anymore that I was entirely right. For my mother, that was enormous. I knew that. I told her so. I don't know if I can talk to her, she said. You don't have to decide that right now. She'd probably hang up anyway. She wouldn't, she really wouldn't. Another silence, softer this time. You said she remembers Grandma, my mother said. She has photographs, ones I've never seen, from the hospital visits from the last few years. I heard my mother exhale. I'd like to see those, she said, so quietly I almost missed it. That was enough. That was more than enough for now. I don't have a tidy conclusion for you. My mother and my aunt haven't had a conversation yet. At the time I'm telling you this, they haven't spoken in over 30 years, and that kind of silence doesn't end with a single phone call. What I have is a Saturday tea. What I have is a cousin I'm learning to know from a distance, through text messages and the occasional video call when she surfaces between field seasons. What I have is a photograph of my grandmother that my aunt gave me to keep. The same grandmother I lost when I was 16, the one I've carried as a blur of warmth and lavender soap, and nothing more specific than that. My aunt framed a copy for me. My grandmother is maybe 25 in the picture, standing in front of a lake somewhere, laughing at whoever is holding the camera. She looks, in some angle of the light, like someone I might recognize. I put it on the shelf above my desk, where I can see it when I'm working. There's something that happens when you spend long enough reading the fine print. You start to understand that most of the injustice in the world doesn't come from dramatic, obvious villains. It comes from ordinary people deciding that a story they were told is easier to live with than the truth. It comes from letting 30 years pass 4 houses away from someone you could have known. I'm not angry at my mother. I want to be clear about that. I understand, in the way you can understand something that still hurts, that she was protecting herself from something. That the story she'd built around that transfer had become load bearing. It was holding up too much of her sense of herself to let go easily. But I'm also 31 years old, and I'm running out of patience for stories that exist to protect the person telling them at the expense of everyone else in them. My aunt's door is unlocked on Saturday mornings. She puts the kettle on before I arrive because I'm always exactly on time. The banana bread is not always there, but the tea is, and the table by the window that catches the morning light, and the woman sitting across from me who knew my grandmother in ways I never got the chance to. That's not nothing. After 30 years of nothing, it is very much something.